First up, I just want to say happy birthday to Helldivers 2. It's crazy to believe that it's already been a year since this game blew up and destroyed its own servers. And to think that we've had the privilege of diving together for 365 days. I want to thank Arrowhead and I want to thank Helldivers 2 community for being so awesome. I also want to thank anyone that watches my videos and discusses the game in the comments, even when we disagree on things, because I think that shows how many builds and playstyles are possible in Helldivers 2. And on that note, we'll have something fun to discuss today, because today we're ranking every armor passive in Helldivers 2. I'm going to be ranking these alphabetically because they're not in any official list altogether in the game, but beware, these are my opinions. And if you disagree, please check out the template I made on tiermaker.com to make your own tier list video. And with that out of the way, let's get on to the rankings. First up, we have the Acclimated passive. Grants a 50% resistance to fire, gas, acid, and electrical damage. Acclimated is a decent passive. It can and will save your life from the sources of damage that were previously mentioned. However, in some cases I would rather specialize myself in one damage type like fire. That way I can run a full fire loadout and not worry about the consequences. The same can be said about gas too if you're into that. But Acclimated does have one unique thing about it, which is the acid damage resistance, which no other passive can provide, meaning that spewers will have a much tougher time killing you. In general, this passive is definitely best against the bugs. That's where you'll be seeing the most fire, gas, and acid. So I'm going to put Acclimated in B tier, I think. I think it's just, average. Next up is Advanced Filtration. Provides 80% resistance to gas damage and effects. If you want to run a gas loadout, then you're obviously going to need this passive. Advanced Filtration gives you an insane amount of damage reduction against gas. 80%. You can drop a gas strike on an area and just live there. Maybe using a stim or two in the process, but you're almost guaranteed to not be killed by whatever is lurking in the gas with you. It is, simply put, incredibly effective if you're using a gas loadout. I personally don't use this one that much because I prefer fire, and I also don't fight bugs very much, and this is obviously most effective against bugs. So it's very specific, but it's pretty good at what it does, so I'm going to put it in B tier. Next up is Democracy Protects. 50% chance to not die when taking lethal damage. Prevents all damage from bleeding if chest hemorrhages. This one is pretty self-explanatory. It flips a coin, and if it's heads, congratulations, you get to live. Until you get hit again, then it flips the coin again. It will happen again and again. If you're being mauled by a ton of bugs or getting shot by a ton of bots, it will essentially just delay your death by a second or two. And the other factor of the passive, the bleeding immunity, could come in handy if you're totally dry on stims, but if you have no stims, you have bigger problems to worry about. In my opinion, this armor passive is just a band-aid. It's a weak solution for death. I know lots of other people like this one, and I think it's pretty cool, but I'm just not going to use it a lot, so I'm putting it in C tier. Next up is Electrical Conduit. Provides 95% resistance to arc damage. This one is also very simple to understand, and 95% resistance to arc damage is no joke. The footage here speaks for itself. You can just live in between 3 Tesla towers. It's pretty great for defending yourself against melee enemies. You can just toss down a Tesla tower and sit in it while the enemies come for you, but they're just too stupid to not walk into an active Tesla tower. This one is, without a doubt, best against the Illuminate because they have multiple sources of arc damage. They have their own Tesla towers, the Watchers, and the Harvesters. So consider taking this passive against the Illuminate. It will definitely save your life when you're clearing out a colony. Now, even though it's quite specific, I'm going to put this in B tier, high B tier. I like this one a lot, but I can't justify using it all the time, obviously. Next up is Engineering Kit. Further reduces recoil when crouching or prone by 30%. Increases initial inventory and holding capacity of grenades by 2. This is definitely one of the best passives in the game, with 2 great effects that will help you in any mission if you put them to use. First off, you have the recoil bonus. This makes high recoil weapons like the Adjudicator or HMG much better at landing their shots. This effect is definitely best against bots, because you won't always be on the run. You'll have time to slow down and get into a real firefight, which is where crouch and prone are most viable. And speaking of bots, I'm a thermite addict myself, so the extra grenades are incredible for fighting the most armored faction in the game. Having a couple of extra thermites to use against something like a factory strider is a significant bonus. Or, if you prefer other grenades like frags, then you're in luck. This passive will let you carry 7 of those. So I'm gonna put this one in S tier. I think Engineering Kit is one of the best. Next up is Extra Padding. Provides a higher armor rating. Extra Padding is definitely the simplest out of all the passives. I mean, just read that description. And it's standard issue for new players. The basic B01 tactical sets all have this passive, and for good reason. You get the mobility of medium armor with the defense of heavy armor. So this armor is perfect if you just like to be a guy with a gun, instead of specializing in something particular like fire. You can't go wrong with this one. It's great against every faction, and it works on any difficulty. So I'm going to put Extra Padding in A tier. Next up is the Fortified passive. Further reduces recoil when crouching or prone by 30%. Provides 50% resistance to explosive damage. Fortified is the ultimate passive if you want to engage in some trench warfare with some bots. You get the recoil buff that Engineering Kit has, which is obviously great, but you can also take an absolute beating from explosives, which, again, is best against bots. Typically, this passive is found on heavy armor, and since mobility isn't the biggest concern when fighting against bots, heavy armor synergizes really well with this passive when fighting them. Simply put, you will have an insane amount of defense when using this passive. Now, I think if you compare this with Engineering Kit, the grenade buff is a much more versatile buff. It applies to all factions because you always want to have more grenades. So I'm going to put this in A tier. A tier. Next up is Inflammable. Provides 75% damage resistance to fire, allowing the bearer to rest assured in their inflammability. If you like flamethrowers or other incendiary weapons, then you're the target audience for this passive, and it's not hard to understand why. This will let you walk through the fire and the flames and carry on. You can push yourself into a horde of bugs, burning them all and standing among the ashes without consequence. If that sounds cool to you, then by all means use this passive. But keep in mind that you won't be getting much else out of it. So I'm going to put this one in like a high B tier. Again, it's very, very situational, but I think it's really fun, and I like flamethrowers. And by the way, these two icons look very similar. This one over here on the right is for acclimated, and this one over here is for inflammable. I grabbed these off the Helldivers wiki, so I'm gonna assume they're accurate. Next up is our newest passive, Integrated Explosives. Armor explodes 1.5 seconds after the wearer dies. Our newest passive is perhaps our most democratic. Integrated Explosives detonates your armor after death, taking any nearby enemies with you and preventing your body from becoming voteless. This one is only going to be useful against melee enemies, so it's obviously best against bugs. The damage is pretty good, however, I think the radius is a bit small, but I understand that if they increased the radius by too much, it might lead to team killing. Overall, I'm not a huge fan of this one. I would rather take a passive that lets me survive instead of relying on my death to be useful. But it is pretty cool, and it can lead to some awesome moments. I'm going to put that in C tier, or along with the Democracy Protects. Next up is Medkit. Increases initial inventory and holding capacity of stims by 2. Increases stim effect duration by 2 seconds. Medkit is another great passive for survivability. As long as you're not getting one shot too often, being able to heal yourself 6 times is a blessing on every difficulty. And that's not to mention the stims you can share with your squad mates. So you can roleplay as a pseudo-medic class with this passive. The increased duration is nothing to scoff at either, letting you get some extra healing over time. And I haven't even mentioned stamina yet. You can use your extra 2 stims to sprint for longer too. And with the extra duration, that's even more time you can spend sprinting. So Medkit, I think, is also an S tier. I think this is one of the best for sure. Next up, we have Peak Physique, increases melee damage by 100%, improves weapons handling with less drag on weapon movement. If you're a melee lover, then I guess this is the passive for you, but I'm just going to give you my 2 cents on it. I think this passive is the worst one by far. To get full use out of it, you would need to be running with a melee-oriented loadout. That would involve the Constitution, a melee secondary, and throwing knives. 2 of these things are just awful, and it's not the melee secondary. While yes, it does improve your melee, why is that something to build around? Let's talk about the other part of the passive, the weapon handling improvements. It's not noticeable enough to justify taking it, so go ahead and test it out on the heaviest weapons. It's not really enough of an improvement. This passive needs some kind of extra buff in my opinion, because I can't think of a time where I would actually want to take this. So Peak Physique, that's D tier. That's the worst one in the game. Next up is the Scout passive. Markers placed on the map will generate radar scans every 2 seconds. Reduces range at which enemies can detect the wearer by 30%. The Scout passive is what you take when you want to embrace your inner Venom Snake, because if you can actually use this passive right, it turns Helldivers 2 into a budget version of Metal Gear Solid 5. And that is certainly not a complaint. This passive definitely isn't for everyone, of course, but the ability to easily stealth past enemies shouldn't be slept on. The radar pings won't do much for you in most missions, but if you're stealthing, you can use them to get a better read on enemy forces, allowing you to plot a path out of their way. I can only truly recommend it if you're playing solo or with a group that wants to play stealth, but either way, this passive is truly the best at what it sets out to do. So I'm going to put the Scout in A tier, lower A tier, but it's damn useful if you can dedicate yourself to it. Next up is Servo Assisted. Increases throwing range by 30%. Provides 50% more limb health. This one isn't bad, but I wouldn't call it exceptional either. The main draw for me is the throwing distance, and while it can be a bit odd to get used to at first, it is actually very effective at throwing your stratagems further. Throwing something like a 30-80mm barrage is much safer with this passive for sure, so if you want more range on your grenades and stratagems, then this is the one for you. The limb health is also a good bonus, but I wouldn't call it groundbreaking stuff, but it's a nice little bonus. So I'm going to put Servo Assisted in like a mid B tier, I think. It's a very average and somewhat useful stratagem. Passive, I meant. Next up, we have Siege Ready. Increases reload speed of primary weapons by 30%. Increases ammo capacity of primary weapons by 20%. Siege Ready is my personal favorite passive in the whole game. Not only are these bonuses great, but the passive is actually bugged, and they apply to all weapon slots. So your support weapons also get these great buffs, which is incredible for any weapon with a stationary reload. This is great against every faction and effective on every difficulty. I just want to take a moment to thank Arrowhead for confirming that they're making this bug into a feature. This was confirmed with the latest patch notes, so Siege Ready is going to be my favorite for a long time. And I'm putting this tippy top at S tier. And finally, we have Unflinching. Helps prevent Helldivers from flinching when hit. In my experience, this passive just doesn't seem to work properly, and if it is, then it needs a buff. You can clearly see in the footage I recorded that you definitely flinch at when shot, so I'm honestly not sure what this passive is even for. I'm willing to bet that this is a bug right now. I recorded this footage right after the patch on February 4th, and I haven't used this armor since it came out before then, so I honestly don't remember what it was like back then. Plus, there's a new bug where first-person mode doesn't correctly show your recoil, so you need to memorize the pattern like it's Counter-Strike. So I'm willing to bet that this is also a buff that has to do with I don't know, character point of view. I'm not sure what's going on with this passive. It just doesn't do anything. So yeah, right now this stuff is useless. And on a technicality, I have to put it in D, because I don't know if it's bugged, I don't know what's going on, but it's just useless. It's worse than Peak Physique. And yeah, here are the final rankings. Let me know what you think down below. I'm willing to have a conversation about any one of these passives, because I think that, they all have their use, except for Unflinching. That thing doesn't do anything. If you have watched all the way to the end, please leave a like on this video, and subscribe for more videos on Helldivers and other co-op games. I'm kind of getting things back on track right now, so I'm gonna have more videos out soon. I also want to shout out a really good friend of mine. She goes by Slumber on YouTube, and she helped me get some screenshots while PSN was down. She makes some funny stuff, and me and her are going to be working on some videos together soon, so go subscribe to her. And that's all I have for today, so this is the SES Prophet of Dawn signing off.